But perhaps only an English teacher would jump into a literary text upon reading these words. But that's what I, in fact, did. And perhaps it's partly because for many, many years I always began my graduate course and my undergraduate course in Southern literature with a Faulkner novel. I always figured if we could get through Faulkner, we would be like people at the top of that hill in Ripley. It would be all downhill from there. Usually I would start with Go Down Moses, which is my favorite of Faulkner's. I guess it changes around. But in Go Down Moses, as you know, there are several interlocking stories that have to do with characters who relate to one another over time and over race and over history. But in the most famous story, The Bear, the young white protagonist at the age of 21, about the year 1885, meets his older cousin Cass in the commissary of the plantation that had belonged first to his grandfather, old Carruthers McCaslin, and then to his father and uncle. And that now, at the age of 21, he is going to inherit. 5 years earlier, at the even younger age of 16, he had gone to that same commissary and he had lifted down from a high shelf several leather-bound books that constituted the ledger for the plantation, and in which his grandfather, and then his father, and his father's twin brother, and then his older cousin had written down all the business transactions of the plantation since it had been first built. And so, of course, it was a history as well as a business book, and the two were intertwined. In this ledger, 16-year-old Ike McCaslin discovers his grandfather's great crimes against his slaves, crimes including incest. But he also discovers the small crimes, those everyday cruelties of racism and arbitrary power over others that had been enacted in his name by his family. And so, in the commissary at age 21, Ike refuses to take his inheritance in an attempt to remove himself from memory, I think, and to live outside the stranglehold of his own and his region's history. And also, of course, to deny that history any access to his identity, the way he sees himself. Having discovered his grandfather's sins, he seeks to blot them out by relinquishing, declaring dead to him that property, and by extension, his own guilt. Now, maybe you can see where I'm going with this. I think we might call our columnist Ike II. Both of them decline to take responsibility for the past, which they seek to repudiate and relinquish for good enough reasons. It's full of guilt, and of course, as they say, in effect, and quite truly, this story is not me. It's not my story. It doesn't reflect who I am, and I'm not going to be bound within it. So, Go Down Moses is about how we read the South in its many contexts. And it's also about how impossible it is to get out of one's full, complete narrative. Everyone has a story, and a story becomes a story, in part because it happens in time, with beginnings and middles and ends, the way all narratives do. But also, stories happen in community, and they happen in history. And as one critic has said, in spite of all Ike's relinquishing, what he thought he had relinquished won't relinquish him. So, here we have a literary text and a context. And I think it's interesting to note that a great deal of Southern literature works in this same area of how we read our story in reading the story of where we live and where that story resides most meaningfully. Is it on the busy streets that lead down to a river, or is it in its statues, or is it in the strip malls that have taken over the old plantations? Where do we find it, and when we find it? What does this land produce? As a poet of the 1920s, Alan Tate once asked. Two novels in particular took the story of Go Down Moses and used it, and in particular used its textual quality. That is, in Go Down Moses, Faulkner makes his own novel a parallel to the ledgers. And he tries to show us how the South can be read and misread in those ledgers. But one thing those ledgers will never be is immobile, stationary, not moving, not changing, and not subject to revision to everyone who reads them. And so with his own novels. And two very important Southern novelists took Go Down Moses itself as a text and rewrote it. You may not have thought about it this way, but both of these writers have actually admitted a debt to Faulkner in the writing of these two novels. One of them is by a fellow Ohioan. A lot of people wouldn't call her a Southern writer, but if she's not a Southern writer, I don't know who is. Toni Morrison. And when she wrote Song of Solomon, now she'd already written her master's thesis on William Faulkner. When she wrote Song of Solomon, she took the tropes of that book, Go Down Moses, and in particular, she took the idea of having a text like the ledgers and having it appear and reappear and be read and misread and revised all the way through the novel, just the way Faulkner has Ike and others read and misread and revise the ledgers according to their own needs and agendas. In her case, and I think in part because she's an African-American woman writer, the text is a song, and it is an oral, delivered song. And young Milkman Dead, the grandson of Macon Dead the first and the son of Macon Dead the second, finally, in a small town in Virginia, hears the full text of that song, fragments of which he's heard all his life. And hearing that song and putting its puzzle together finally, Milkman comes to terms with a past that his own father has tried to deny for many, many years, and that he would just as soon do without. His quest, though, is the same quest of Ike, and the same quest of our students, I think, and the same quest of our columnist in Raleigh. It's a search for how to connect, or even whether to connect to the past. So, we have Milkman Dead sitting and listening to children singing this song before a storefront. And then in another novel, this novel by an Appalachian woman writer, Lee Smith, in Family Linen, one of her novels, does the same exact thing. She has a young woman, a daughter named Lacey, of a woman named Elizabeth Bird, whom she's gone far, far away from in order to leave behind her difficult mother and the difficult world of the past that her mother represents. But after her mother dies, she, like the other siblings in the family, has to come home. And when she does, and when the siblings are doing what families do as they break up a house, they are trying to decide what to do with all those material things. And Lacey finds a diary that her mother had written. And in that diary, she finds a set of secrets that explain a great deal of why her mother was the way she was. And she begins to understand that this, in some ways, that she doesn't like at all, explains why she is the way she is. But for all of Elizabeth's children, the struggles are a result of their separation from and their ignorance of, and mostly and importantly perhaps, their attempt to deny the heritage that they have. In the end of this novel, a pregnant granddaughter's wedding dress is made out of one of Elizabeth's old heirloom lace tablecloths. So another text to be passed on finds its way into and out of and beyond the way it has been read and used and thought of. Well, I think it's time to go back home. And first we might go back to Raleigh and to that monument to the Confederate dead that some might very well want to do away with, since like the ledger in the commissary, it tries to attach us to things which we are quite rightly sure we find repugnant. We might want to dismiss it simply as an unsolvable riddle, the way Milkman first tries to dismiss that song that he hears in front of the store. We might try to unread it or not read it, like Lacey tries not to read the diary from her mother when she is forced back into her dead mother's house, as we are forced back into the dead houses of our families and the dead houses of people who own us in ways that are hard to break. They're all texts that do the talking and the teaching, and yet, of course, they're full of open spaces as well that are always filled with others' voices and visions and interpretations. And that's why I loved Brer Rabbit, by the way. I didn't just love Brer Rabbit, I loved that book, The Complete Tales of Uncle Remus. And what I loved about it was that it was very clear to me that there were 3 different stories all going on at the same time from different points of view and being told by different voices, and yet they were being forced to come together in ways that were quite explosive. The first voice, of course, was Joel Chandler Harris, the man who created Uncle Remus as a fictional character, but then let Uncle Remus tell stories that Joel Chandler Harris himself had heard when he was a boy on a plantation. Now, when he wrote the Uncle Remus tales, he was the co-editor of the most important newspaper in the South, the Atlanta Constitution, after the Civil War. But when he had lived on the plantation, he had not been a little plantation boy who had grown up there. He was very much like me, an exile. His mother was an Irish laboring washerwoman, and he was her illegitimate child. And he grew up working on the plantation down in Georgia in this kind of medial, liminal position between the big house and the slave quarters. And while he was there, he heard those stories that the slaves would tell. And he understood something about them that he later put into the introduction to his collection of tales. He says, you know, it doesn't take a genius to figure out why slaves like Uncle Remus, who became his spokesperson, why slaves find these tales so important to them. It's because, he said, slaves identify with this figure who is in a world where he has no power or very little in comparison to the other creatures, and where the only way he manages is by his wits. But the other thing I loved about Brer Rabbit was that he didn't just manage to survive in those stories the slaves told. And you see this in Uncle Remus. Again, white supremacist, racist Joel Chandler Harris, because he was all of those things, managed, when he created Uncle Remus and set him up to tell those stories, managed to show that Uncle Remus takes great relish in those stories himself. Not because they are taking him back to the good old days before the war, but because not only does Brer Rabbit survive, but sometimes he takes great pride in just stomping all over other people for the sheer pleasure of it. And in that kind of relish, Uncle Remus is showing 2 very different sides. Out of one side of his mouth, he's supposed to be showing the North along with his creator, how good the South had been to its own black folks. But out the other side, Brer Rabbit is showing the world in a really almost mirror image what the real plantation South looked like. A place where brute strength and animal greed were always threats, and a wily rabbit insists on expressing himself and being proud of himself and not just surviving in that world. So I had Brer Rabbit, and since then I've had Lacey in Family Linen, and Milkman Dad in Song of Solomon, and Ike McCaslin in Go Down Moses. But most recently, I've had someone else. And I've had this someone thanks to you and your conference last year, during which you had a speaker who addressed you at that conference. And lo and behold, when one of you brought back one of his books for me to take a look at, the first thing I noticed on the back was, of course, he's from Danville, Kentucky, where my grandpa was born. But he was writing about a South that he called Appalachia. Appalachia? What is Appalachia? Well, you read his book, Frank Walker's collection of poems called Appalachia, and in a poem about a girl named Sarah Yabo. That's not really her name, but it's about a student in his class who came from Sarah Yabo and who did not like that word he created, that word called Appalachia, with 2 F's, by the way. She did not like that word because she said, I do not like anything that separates people by region or culture or class. And Frank, or the narrator, thinks about what she has said. And the question she asked, why would I embrace division? How could I wrap my arms around a carcinogen when division kills? I wanted to tell her, though, the narrator says, that the word Appalachia was not intended to take lives, not intended to destroy families or divide communities, that it existed, as I think all our Souths exist when we're willing to read them and revise them. It existed, he says, to make visible, to create a sense of place that had not existed for us, for any unwealthy, common people of color. And that's what Appalachia means. Now, in the last poem of the book, Frank Walker does exactly what Faulkner and Lee Smith and Toni Morrison do. He takes a text and makes that text teach. Lets the text do the talking. Now, his text is not a diary or a song or a book. It is photographs. And this is his poem, and I'm going to close with it, because I think it's us, not just as Southerners, not just as teachers, but as students as well. He says, if I thought it made a difference, I'd round up everybody I know, bring them to this place, this Clifton, let them see what used to be ours. If I thought it mattered, I bring my son and daughter, my nieces and nephews to the old schoolhouse and draw detailed maps in the air. Maps that highlighted the 33 beautiful acres bordered by the low, slow curve of the Dix River. If I thought they'd listen, I'd produce a PowerPoint presentation featuring all the faded yellow photographs in Aunt Willie's archives. I'd point to the clean white dresses, leather boots, and niggers, and the serious looks on Granddaddy's 10-year-old face, and how much we all favored each other, even then, even under a hat. I'd pass around a restored print of their great-great-grandmother Margaret, who passed when Mama E was just 6 years old, hoping they recognized the high cheekbones and regal disposition that survived 5 generations of mothers and daughters and deaths, boldly suggesting that their own beauty wasn't accidental, that it was actually a precious family heirloom. Projecting an IMAX-sized photo of Mama's graduating class on the wall, I'd draw attention to the proud and focused faces standing and kneeling in 2-feet-high weeds, wearing dark caps and gowns like gold crowns and kente, clutching diplomas like freedom passes, holding on to each other with their eyes. If I thought it was worth the effort, I would try not to be too anxious or too teary-eyed, while I hoped at least one of them would memorize these things and pass it on until it mattered. Thank you.